The New York City chapter of the Historical Novel Society is pleased to present this recording from September 22nd, 2021. Whodunnit? Historical Mysteries and Thrillers. This is the latest installment of our ongoing Readers series, curated by Steering Committee member Loretta Goldberg, to introduce our members to new authors. She moderated our guest panel of R.L. Crossland, author of the Abalone Ukulele, Nev March, author of Murders in Old Bombay, and Margaret Mendell, author of Pushing Water. The authors read a sample from their books and answered questions from the moderator and the audience about their characters, writing practices, research, the history and setting of their stories, plus much more. Information about our chapter and its leadership is available at our website, listed in the description. Thank you, and enjoy the program.
Well, hi all. Thanks for joining us. We have three wonderful authors with some very exotic books in very appealing settings. I drew lots to see what author would go in what order, and it was Nev March, followed by Roger Crossland, followed by Margaret Mendell. So I will give you just a brief intro on each of the authors, and then they will each speak about their books for 10 minutes apiece, up to 10 minutes, and then it's open Q&A. So Nev March is the first Indian-born author to win the Minotaur Books Mystery Writers of America Best First Crime Fiction. Amazon picked up Murder in Old Bombay as an editor's pick, and the New York Times has referred to it as one of the best crime fiction novels of 2020. In addition, it is a nomination for the Anthony, the Barry, the Edgar, the Hammett, and the McGavity Awards. Congratulations, Nev, and she has just announced sequels. Now, she's an immigrant herself, like I don't know how many other people here, and she has written nonfiction as well as fiction and appeared on NPR, Mystery Tribune, Mystery Scenes magazine, Crime Reads, and Book Page. Her writing teems with questions of identity. Who are we? What pieces of our culture and heritage come to the fore under different pressures? So welcome, Nev. Roger Crossland is the son of a French-Moroccan Red Cross nurse and a US Army captain who met, guess where? Casablanca during World War II. How romantic, I can't resist that. Humphrey Bogart, Ingrid Bergman, round up the usual suspects. Well, anyway, Roger Crossland served 35 years as a US Navy SEAL, active and reserve, 2 hot wars, 1 cold one, with tours in the Far East, the settings that populate his novels. He enjoys the challenge of projecting his grasp of naval intrigue onto an earlier century. He's had articles published in the New York Times and the US Naval Institute proceedings on unconventional naval warfare. His first crime novel, Jade Rooster, which we presented here at HNS, won the Admiral David Farragut Glasgow Award, Book Award in 2008. And by the way, Roger was also a lawyer. Now, Margaret Mendell has had 2 novels published by small presses, Pushing Water, tonight's presentation, and Fish Kicker, and also a volume of short stories, Patches. Her pieces, nonfiction and fiction pieces, have been published in online and print magazines. She has a long career in non-writing as well, 30 years working with adults with psychiatric disabilities and intellectual disabilities. And other kinds of jobs have been fry cook, shoe repair, power sewing machine operator, which gives her a wonderful breadth in creating her characters. Margaret loves to travel. She likes to photograph, draw, paint, illustrate, and she has been a writer since almost childhood, beginning with her own personal journals. So welcome all of you, and Nev, take it away.
Thank you so much for having me, Loretta. I'm so honored to be here, and in such great company. So thank you. I'm going to tell you a little bit about my book. It's literally a paragraph, and then I will read a few pages because I think the best way for you to get a sense of a book is to sample a little bit of it. And then I'm happy to turn over to Roger. So my book is set in colonial India during the period when Britain ruled India. Britain had control of India for about 300 years, which ended in 1947. So this book is based, it's a historical mystery. It's based on a tragedy that really occurred in my community, and it occurred in 1892. The mystery was never really solved. There were court cases, but they were inconclusive because there really wasn't enough evidence. And the police were essentially just being formed at that point in time. They really came from the military, weren't really very good detective procedures in place. So Captain James Agnihotri is a character that I created. He's a recovering soldier. He's moved by a letter in the newspaper, which is written by Adi, a young widower. And Adi's bride and sister fell from the university clock tower in broad daylight, fell to their deaths. The letter says that they simply could not have committed suicide, as is commonly believed. Captain Jim is puzzled because the details don't add up. It's obsessed with this mystery. It's in the papers every day. And leaving hospital, he decides to investigate. This involves him in a whole lot of trouble. It leads him into an action adventure, a love story, and ultimately a journey across India in the middle of political turmoil and rebellion. So I'm going to read 3 pages, 2.5 pages from the middle of the book, because a mystery is so intertwined. I'm actually going to read a little vignette that happens that isn't tied directly to the mystery, but is one of his adventures, because that is a self-standing piece and kind of like a short story in the middle of the book. Dusk was upon us as we decided to search the crumbling fortifications on the edge of town. The Gurkha troop we were searching for might have secured themselves in its maze of corridors and tunnels, but in the dark, how could we find them? Ranbir paid the sleepy stableman who spat sideways on the straw and then untied our horses. I climbed into the saddle and pointed my Arabian to the town outskirts. She walked gently, hooves clip-clopping in the starry night. The market having closed, we wove through a few villagers trudging homeward. Night comes quickly in the mountains. The air was crisp and still. Navigating cobbles long since crumbled that lay loose and uneven in our path, our horses' hooves clinked on stone, high notes interspersed with hoofbeats. I winced. Could the sentries at the crossroads hear us? The fortress loomed dark and formless. It had been shelled years ago, leaving wide gashes in the wall, a wall that bled piles of stone, great blocks of it slowing our pace. The outer fortifications towered on my right. I nudged my horse along the perimeter, trusting her to navigate the rubble. Rein slack, she stepped carefully, dropping her head now and again to sniff at stones. Stopping at a dark hollow, a crevice in the wall, she shook her mane as though to ask, "Are you bloody sure you want to do this?" She'd found the way into the fortress, but could we find our way out? Night is not the time to explore unfamiliar terrain. Yet it was all we had. My injury had cost us 3 days. With a nudge of my knees, the Arabian stepped through the broken archway into the fortress courtyard. A sliver of moon left the clouds to gleam high above, allowing me a view of vast fortifications. 2 turrets loomed at either end of a forward wall, vantage points to pick us off with a bullet. The courtyard offered no shelter between outer and inner walls, a space designed to trap intruders. Baudi, said Ranbir, this is not a good place. An archway to one side led to an inner locus, the zinana or women's quarters, marked by narrow windows overlooking a courtyard. I hesitated, reluctant to enter a maze of unfamiliar passages, but there was no help for it. We must find Greer's men and Dr. Aziz. Grateful for moonlight, I searched the shadows for movement. The air was cooler amid the fog and silent stones. Among these walls, one could almost believe in spirits. Suddenly, a plaintive wail wound through the ruin, creeping over bare stones, chilling in its despair. My breath caught, disbelieving. The Arabian lurched sideways, hooves clattering, a familiar sound, comforting in its normalcy, in contrast to the otherworldly cry. The screech faded, leaving an unexpected silence. I held tight to the reins, cold creeping over my skin. We should leave this alien place. What is it? Ranbir whispered, my hands soothing my mount. Rubbing her twitching withers, I said, steady, old girl. There was something peculiar about the torn cry, a familiar quality despite its eerie resonance. When I nudged the Arabian, she set off at a happy trot. Astonished, I held her back until I realized that her gait meant something. Could she know that sound? Then it struck me, good Lord, that eerie note came from army bagpipes. I loosed the reins, letting the Arabian find it. Ranbir followed, uttering prayers. The Arabian sidled to a stairway, her feet dancing, her ears up and alert, eager and high-strung. I dismounted, holding her bridle. Ruko, a voice commanded me to stop. I stiffened, heard Ranbir's startled breath and understood. The sepoys of the 21st Gurkha Rifle Regiment were expert snipers. Only their reluctance to reveal themselves had saved us from a marksman's bullet. Still clinging to the saddle, I whistled two notes every sepoy would know. Someone chuckled. Mescal, the quiet voice said in English.
Great.
Thank you. Appreciate it. I'll hand over the remaining time, if there's any, to Roger.
Oh, well, thank you. My name is Roger Crossland, and a happy autumnal equinox to you all. I like the Zoom format. It allows me to wear socks that don't match. Of course, you can get your audio cut off faster than a vaudeville hook if you misbehave on the system, the Zoom system, but I will behave. The Abalone Ukulele, A Tale of Far Eastern Intrigue, is a historical novel set in 1913 Shanghai, where four countries are about to collide: China, Japan, Korea, and the US. The point of collision is 3 tons of Japanese gold ingots meant to undermine an already collapsing China. The novel is told primarily from 3 viewpoints. My short reading, not a prologue or first chapter, is told from the viewpoint of Yi, a disgraced tribute captain of couriers and chief protagonist in the novel. It is 1898, and we are steaming up the Inside Passage, Alaska bound, aboard a tired side wheeler, a converted ferry destined for Skagway and overloaded with chichacos, or that is, Yukon greenhorn prospectors. At this point, Yi is a lonely Korean in a very dangerous land. And I start my reading here. Of the 3 sets of boots that had rested on the stern deck, only the gumboots remained. The young man in the gumboots looked around, and Yi drew back into the shadows. He realized that in the space of mere seconds, the young man in the Mackinaw had the throats of two older men, robbed them, and pitched them over the stern rail into the water. The young man smiled strangely, and the smile seemed beamed in Yi's direction. The other men Yi had seen with the young man before seemed to flow forward toward their companion out of nowhere, pause, and then they too smiled. They clapped shoulders. Yi guessed the older men's bunks would have been stripped of anything valuable, their luggage identified and divided. Was Yi sure what he'd seen? Had he really seen anything at all? He predicted plenty of dead men and lost men before the sidewheeler found its way to Skagway. He knew the meaning of the two deft movements across the throat, a knife, a razor. Everyone aboard had one or two of these. He had seen similar work in Tientsin. The rumor was that no lawmen did civilized duty in Alaska. And if you needed to civilization's duty in Alaska, and if they needed to do something about a crime, you had to do it yourself or rely on a miners' committee. On this ship, Yi was known as Snowfall, a nickname that derived from his halting description of his ability to keep a kitchen. It would be clean white, like snow from sky. He knew the nickname was a joke. However, he also knew the joking name suggested a degree of acceptance. His experience was pretty much the same back in San Francisco, China, and even in Korea. During the past 5 years, he'd become adept at staying alive. Humor was as useful as an edged weapon when it came to survival. Humor could turn a foreigner into a non-threatening fellow traveler. Acceptance meant continued existence. He'd need to collect many more such markers before he'd dare to rock this vessel with a report of a double murder. He looked into the wake again and saw only paddle wheel turbulence. If the two men were astern of the ship in the water, they weren't flailing to keep themselves afloat. A cry for help on the way to the Klondike was a waste of breath. He looked again, and the young man in the Mackinac jacket was being hugged under the arm of one of his group. Yes, this had a family aspect to it. The young man was supported. Then the group of men disappeared into the interior of the sidewheeler. The situation was like one of those riddles the Zen monks used to explain life. This, however, was a riddle about death. A man's throat is cut and he falls overboard without a sound. Did he ever exist? He had been a man of action once, a man who had guarded fortunes in silver and gold. Yet on this side of the Pacific, he felt frail and inconsequential. He inquired about the group in the galley, and the senior steward shook his head. The senior steward was a patient man. Them, the family in question's name is Spuyten. The old man's just bought liquor for everyone. A fine swell he is. Them five behind him with the long arms are his bullying brood. The elder Spuyten impishly spilled gold pieces onto the galley counter. No need to fret, steward. Nothing is too good for my friends, all my new friends. The steward turned to Yi and kept his voice low. Yeah, he's a sport. Just watch your back, your throat, and your money around the likes of that family. Spuyten's collecting his own acceptance markers, Yi thought uncomfortably. The steward met Yi's eyes. You're a Chinaman, and that's a kind of disadvantage. Like all bullies, Spuyten wants his prey to have some sort of disadvantage. I've seen some of the sourdoughs coming back, and they look nothing like the ones you see here. Red rims around the eyes, and you'll see them sleeping standing up, the steward added. They will be at a disadvantage. Hellfire sees the world in terms of wolves and sheep, and he's a wolf. The steward glanced briefly Hellfire's way. That might be insulting to wolves. I'd steer very clear of that lot, Snowfall, my Chinese shipmate. Hellfire Spite is a down-on-his-luck schooner's mate, known for smashing crews' heads with blocks and tossing them over the side on a whim. He's soaring like a buzzard in an updraft tonight, higher than any mountain in Alaska one night and lower than a clam's belly the next. His mate's ticket is in jeopardy. I'd say Hellfire's got a dangerous turn of mind and he's desperate, the steward concluded. The one you asked about, the red plaid coat, the Mackinaw jacket, that's Elias. Word is Hellfire's celebrating something he did today. That concludes the end of the reading. The question you might want answered is, what's Crossland's value? What's his added value as a writer? Well, there are two. First, I know what it feels like to engage in prolonged and intense risk. I've drawn considerable double hazardous duty pay and combat pay. In civilian life, as a lawyer, I represented clients in high-stake situations. I know the feel of cold sweat running down the back of my neck. Secondly, I know what it feels like to be at the intersection of very different and desperate clashing cultures, and how to help those intersecting factions reach a goal. A very useful but very underappreciated art. I know the puzzlement of hearing a counterpart saying yes and not being sure what that means. Does it mean I hear, or does it mean I agree? So with that, I wrap up and pass it on to Margaret.
Well, I would like to share with you how my novel came about. It's a novel based in Vietnam in 1939. Something that I initially knew nothing about. But what it always puzzled me was because I'm from the 60s, I did my bit as a youth and protesting and wondering about what we were doing in Vietnam in the 60s and 70s. But I always wondered what it was originally about. Where did all of this begin, and what was the deal? So I just started doing some research, and much like Alice in Wonderland, I got too curious and I fell through a rabbit hole. And that's the internet, and that's buying books that have nothing to do with my daily life and something to do with communism in the 30s and 20s, and it went on and on and on. So I went online and I went on eBay and I started querying about books from the 30s, politically oriented books about the Orient in the 30s. And I found huge amounts of people that were getting rid of old books from that era. And I have a feeling some of them were probably, old communists that had passed on, and the kids had found a bunch of books in Papa's closet and were, selling them on eBay for, $2, $3, making, and so now I have numbers and numbers of books that, have all kinds of information. Original work that was done by Ho Chi Minh and women who were, at war, in Vietnam, written by Vietnamese women, translated into English. It you know, it was just such a lot of fun doing the research. But then I realized it had nothing to do with anything that I was doing, and all of a sudden a character started to arise. And what I had been most interested in as I was reading is that because the French were so invested in turning Vietnam into a little France and Paris mostly, they had, architecture was done in the, you would think that you were walking down, you know, some Parisian street in some of the areas in Vietnam. But there was something about what they were doing with the literature, the ancient literature of Vietnam. Old poets, renowned and very popular and famous ancient poets that went back to Confucius time. And what the French started to do was they started to compile every bit of literature that had been written and or transcribed from the spoken poet, and it was being gathered up. And what they wanted to do is they wanted to take it all away, take it back to Paris, and pretend like it didn't exist. So what I found was there was a character in there, a female character, Sarah, who was a woman who was mourning and had never got over the death of a lover, was traveling around the world, ended up in Paris, found a job offering in Vietnam, and she says, that's about as far away from anything that I could ever get. Maybe life will change for me then. And so she went to Vietnam and took the job as an archivist. She had been a librarian in Kansas City. So what began to start as just an interesting exploration of history turned into a novel, something that I had not expected, though I do write, but I don't know why I didn't expect it to turn into a novel, but it did. And so I had this this female character, and the next thing I know, she had a landlady that was, you know, kind of a busybody, and there were all these, and so I had a story going. But being mostly a mystery writer, I needed a body. So I had to kill somebody. And so there's where the story then began, is that she initially finds a murdered co-worker that she liked very much. And the story just sort of evolves from that. And I kept reading about what was happening with the communists, what was happening with the fascists. And then it turns out that she has a friend who was a reporter and had been in Spain because the Spanish Civil War was going on at that time, and it just turned fascist. And she left. Her friend Julia left Spain, went to Paris, and ended up coming to visit and stay with Sarah, my archivist. So the initial story was simple enough: a woman moving away from a tragedy in her life, trying to find a way to get away from it, going to a very exotic place, and finding herself, as most characters do, find themselves in more trouble than what they thought they were going to end up doing or getting involved with. So it was an interesting journey just to write it, because I had to take so many roads, so many countries, so many things that were going on in the world at that time that I had no idea, really. I mean, I knew there was a lot, but I had no idea how much was going on at the time. And I don't know if I had known that there was that much going on, whether I would have really attempted, it would have seemed unsurmountable but I started like a little ant, at the bottom of a hill, just sort of working my way up through the story. And it became, there's a ghost in it. There's a ghost who is and he's ever present in the story. Every several chapters, he comes in as a spirit, first not knowing that he is dead, and then knowing what is going on, and then warning Sarah of, in her dreams and in her feelings and her sensation that something is happening. But, she has a lover, Sarah has a lover, the archivist has a lover who is a Russian communist who is, working to fight fascism. And there's just anybody that is anybody in the political world. I ended up trying to get them into the book. And I'd like to read a very short thing that was something that when the ghost, the dead translator from the archive, this is one of the things about almost halfway through the book, he says, after questioning what's going on, where am I, what's happening, I don't understand where things are in the world anymore, because he doesn't realize he's dead. Now, this is what he says about almost a third the way into the book. Chaos. The world has turned upside down. The sweet soy milk of my childhood smells of urine. Sunrise brings bats to my door. Sarah, the frightened monkey living in your kitchen cabinet, has watched for years as wars floated above our head. Hidden, he's seen the corruption. It rumbles like thunder in a blackened sky. I watch my lover, Themai, heard my words. I lay in the folds of her garment, her tears falling on me like a soft rain. And her garden we were wedded in sorrowful ceremony. There is no returning to my grave. My choice is made. He has decided to, in his own way, as a spirit, join the forces that he believes would bring his country back to the ownership of the people of his country. He wants his country back. So it's pushing water. And I must tell you that my publisher has gone belly up as a result of poor health, and all of my books that she so lovingly published are no longer available. I am now what you consider an out-of-print author, but I keep writing.
Well, the Authors Guild actually has a back and print operation, so you might want to look into that. Well, thank you all. It's now question and answer. I have a question for Roger, but I'm happy to defer it. Silence.
Loretta, we're
All
going
right.
to get our questions in the next few minutes. They're going to type them in the chat field. So why don't you take the first few questions?
Yes, okay. So Roger, in the back of my copy of the book, you have some product placement. This is very unusual in historical fiction. A certain brand of bourbon. And so what I would like, I think everybody would be really interested to know how you figured out a certain character drank that brand of bourbon, and that the company still existed, and that you contacted them, and that they're doing some marketing.
Well, somewhere I'd read in promoting your book, it's good to have a sponsor. And I came across a diary a sailor's diary referring to this particular bourbon, which is now I'm drawing a blank here.
Cyrus Noble.
Cyrus Noble, there we go.
Yeah.
And that plays into some of the humor that a Charlie Noble is a galley stovepipe. And there's also Stevedore, whose last name is Noble. And then of course there's Cyrus Noble. And anyway, in the diary set written in about 1903, the sailor is with one of his friends, and they're in Nagasaki, and they walk into it's cold and rainy, and one of them invites the other into this little wine and alcohol shop owned by a little old Japanese lady, and one looks to the other and says, I'm buying. What's the best you have here, ma'am? And she says, Cyrus Noble. And so right away, there was my lever for calling these guys and taking the log and photocopying it, and saying, well, here, you've been around for quite a while. And they have a historical promotion about gold mining. That's essentially Cyrus Noble was a 1849 gold prospector, and then he provided alcohol for the gold rush in Alaska too. Primarily, he was out of Alaska. Ultimately, that alcohol was how Admiral Dewey, the Battle of Manila Bay, was what he toasted his promotion to Admiral of the Fleet. And it is historically documented. So Cyrus Noble has a naval connection, and it has a Pacific connection. Here they were finding it in Nagasaki, and it was a drink you treated other people to as a gesture, camaraderie, and also it was the joke, the drink that Dewey toasted his promotion to the highest rank of the Navy for another 4 or 5 decades. So there was a connection, and I said, this might be a way of promoting your product, and they went with it. Now, I only put it in the paperback version. It's not in the ebook, and it's not in the hardback. Hardback goes to libraries. I didn't know what kind of trouble I'd get in putting alcohol advertising in a library book, and it might not make it past some of the screening committees. But there's a historical connection. They acknowledge this historical connection, and they paid for the ad. So that brought a little more in the way of revenue for my publisher and me.
Great.
But what you're doing is hijacking them, because of course they are going out and circulating that book and handing it out as a token, a promotional token.
Good.
That's great. Congratulations. So Susan, do we have questions?
You sure do. Let's start with the first one from Lori. Lori wanted to know, has everyone been to the places that they've written about?
I'm happy to take that. Yeah, I have. And so this is the cover of Murder in Old Bombay. And up here is the place where the events happened. The 2 girls fell from about that spot in the gallery down about 200 feet and to their deaths. So this university clock tower is in the middle of Bombay University and is closed to the public, has been since the girls' deaths in 1892. But I was able to get special permission because I had written the book, and its original title was actually the Rajabai Tower Mystery, which is the name of the tower. So I was able to get special permission to go up. And I've written about it. It's on my website. I do not recommend anybody do that. It was a horrendous experience. I realized I was claustrophobic halfway up the tower. It was 95 degrees in the shade. It was in May. There was no air because they had closed the air holes because birds were getting into the tower. And we went all the way up. I had a lady guard. And then I was told she was not given the key to the gallery where the girls died because they wanted to save me from myself in case I was, planning to commit suicide. So all that work, and I did not actually get to see the gallery, but I did go up the tower.
Well, I'll jump in here if that's permissible. I've been to Korea many times, at least 10 times, and both my children have been adopted from Korea. So just a bunch of connections and different ways of connecting with Korea. I've been up the Inland Passage, and I've been to Alaska and Skagway and all the gold mining areas. As far as China goes, I've been to Hong Kong several times. I've been to Macau, and I've been to Canton Province, but I've never been to Shanghai. And one of the reasons is my ship, when I went into actual China, I limited my visits to one day. So having a background such as mine, I didn't want to linger in communist China at the times I was any times I was able to get there.
Yes, I've been to Vietnam, and it was not like what I had been reading about. It was, a very different country.
Okay, we have another question here from Cynthia. Goes back to you, Nev. What attracted you to this particular story and era?
Yeah, it's a great question. This is a story, the real events were a story that turned a little bit into folklore, but it's the story of the death of the girls, right? The unexplained death of the girls had kind of become family history. They were Parsi girls. Parsis are Zoroastrian girls. That's my community. So I don't know that I'm actually related to them, but they're within my ethnic community. And so when I was growing up as a teenager and I wanted to do something particularly daring, like join the hiking and mountaineering society, okay, my parents would, wanted to refuse essentially. So they would use code words. They're very conservative and didn't want to, say anything that might alarm me, but they did want to caution me. So they would say, remember the Godrej girls. And that was code for bad things can happen even in daytime, right? It was sort of a cautionary tale. So I knew about these girls that had died. They were 15 and 19 years old and belonged to a very wealthy family. But I didn't know the details at the time. There was no internet. And I just thought that they had died a few years ago and maybe, 5 or 10 years ago. It turned out they had died 90 years ago at that time in the 1980s. So although there were a couple of generations had passed, that story was still alive within our community. And it's only later when I came across articles and started researching this that I realized that stuff was going on at the time, simmering resentment against the Brits, against the British rule that affected families. And I started asking questions about my own, of my own parents and my own family, and realized that we had a connection. My own family had a connection to history, and that became the secret at the heart of this story. So I learned about the girls really very long ago, but didn't really do much with it until I decided a few years ago to really explore and find out what it was all about. And I don't know that this is how things happen. I can't claim that, but it could have happened, very much could have happened this way and for these reasons. that I lay out in the book.
That's great. We have another question from Mick Gorey for everyone. He wants to know, authors, how do you approach dialogue for characters who are long dead? Do they get their own manner of speaking, or is it too much sometimes?
Well, I had obviously a character who came back and spoke in more or less poetic form, because that's the way it felt right. It just felt right that he would, have a sense of the ethereal rather than the common man, common person speech.
I can jump in very quickly here. Some of the characters really existed. The two victims in my book, I've given the same names that they actually had, Bacha and Pilu. And Adi is a real person, although I don't use his name because that family still exists and is still in India. So I didn't use their last name, but I gave them a fictitious last name. But that character really existed. I don't know that I was trying for any particular sound. They just kind of popped up fully formed and would speak in the way that they spoke in their own unique style. The time I'm writing in is a formal time, 1890s. Even literature, if you look at, Henry James or any of the classics, the style is a little bit more formal. And so I have a character who's a British officer, although he's half Indian. He's brought up in the army. So again, that goes to a little bit more formal mannerisms. And therefore, the style that he speaks in is somewhat more formal. The whole book is in first person point of view of a 30-year-old recovering soldier. So it felt like he was narrating the story to me, and the voice came with that.
In my book, there is the head of the Shanghai Municipal Police riot squad, and he became very famous in World War II because he taught self-defense to the British commandos. His name was Fairborn. And Fairborn, it gets very tough going dialect, and people tire of it pretty quickly. But if you throw in, a couple words or a little bit of a swagger style, I think that is enough. I have a hard time making it through Huckleberry Finn when Mark Twain does dialect, but if you do too much, it's just too much. But his personality, here he is a police officer, so he comes across one of my characters who is in intelligence in civilian clothes, and he starts asking him very telling questions and making jokes of them. He knows, but he's going to give him a hard time anyway. He knows my guy is all right, but he's going to be a good policeman and let him know that he is a good policeman. So you have to find a balance, and as I said, the dialect can weigh a story so down it's too much.
Roger, as a matter of fact, Yvonne would like to know what inspired you to write the Abalone Ukulele?
Oh boy. I needed an outlet, and I realized I couldn't write anything contemporary. That surprise is the biggest weapon you have in special operations. People write all about tactics. You're hurting your own people. And at the time I started writing this book, I was still on active duty. I was in Afghanistan. But I picked this period because I wanted two naval protagonists, at least. They're deuteragonists. And at this time, sailors are literate. They keep diaries, so I can look at diaries. There are photos I won't write about anything before the invention of the camera. If I can't look in old books of photos and see what the streets look like and what the people look like, I can't capture it. But boy, in Shanghai in the early 20s, and I've got to extrapolate back a little bit. It's in the 20s, most of the photographs come out of Shanghai, but there's still 10 years doesn't make that much difference. You've got to figure less buildings and they're not as tall. And there are less automobiles, and there are trams. There are electric trams. So, but you see the signs and the banners and English signs and Chinese signs, and you're there. For me, I'm living the adventure. Whatever they're doing, I'm living this vicariously. And if I couldn't do that, I wouldn't write. It's fun for me to research these and then project and say, well, here's how I would have done it today. How would they have done it then? And there were clever people back then. And probably there were a lot of special operations. They just didn't get recorded. People could keep a secret back then.
Okay, we have another question here. We have a question from Douglas, and Douglas would like to know, authors, what factors did you consider in creating your protagonists?
So let me answer that. The few choices that you make very early on kind of determine the whole path and sometimes even change the direction of the story. I needed a detective who, could handle himself, who had chops, and who admired Sherlock Holmes, because I admire Sherlock Holmes. Right. So I started out with this Sherlock Holmes fan because Conan Doyle was writing at the time, 88. He came out with first couple of books. And I thought, all right, 91, 92, probably those books are around in India. Military officers will read them. So I chose that as a defining characteristic. But then I also wanted a character who, like Sherlock Holmes, likes disguises, right? So he's got to be able to travel around in India. Well, who could do that, but better than an Anglo-Indian? Because somebody who has the British background and can, navigate a polite society, has the manners of the time and so on, and yet is Indian enough and knows the languages and can get by in the regular people, right? Indian people. So amongst the Pashto, amongst the Pathans, somebody who understands how to work the dockyard, how to sneak around in the stables, somebody who had that common touch as well. So Anglo-Indian was a choice I made. And then I made him a boxer. And that resulted in tons of research because I knew nothing about boxing. I had actually watch a few fights and learn about the rules and realize when. So those choices were driven by what I needed the character to do, but essentially once made, I couldn't unmake them because they became so much a part of the character's personality. And so I always say, beware what you ask for because you'll get it. And yeah, Captain Jim pretty much came up fully formed, and those were the factors that drove my choices. Ultimately, he hijacked the book because I had an outline and he didn't listen to me. So the middle of the book has these adventures where he's going these various things, and I just had to run with it. But all of it made sense way at the end because each of those, it turns out that each of those had a point. I didn't know at the time that I was writing them. I thought I'd probably have to get rid of some of them and end up wasting, weeks and weeks of work. But at the end, when I was trying to solve the secondary plot, it turned out that each of them actually had a reason.
Well, Voltaire said, behind every great crime behind every great fortune is a great crime. So I knew there was going to be a heist. And then I realized there had to be a reason for the heist. So my character is Korean, and he's a courier for large shipments of silver in tribute payment to China. And he is very wronged at the outset of the Sino-Japanese War in 1894. And he is disgraced entirely. So he plots and plots for 20 years to how to get back at the Japanese. And then there's that second big crime, which is the heist of the 3 tons of gold Japanese ingots. So I couldn't, those sailors kind of are connecting the stories in my series. They're not enough involved to allow me to give a big cultural input and show how he feels and why he does what he does. So I see in the future there'll be a local Asian who is going to tell a story, and in a way, my 2 sailors are going to be like Holmes and Watson. However, they're going to be a little more physical, and it's going to be a little more hard-boiled.
So Margaret, is Sarah a real character?
Sarah, yes.
She's a real character.
Yeah, she came, I mean, she just sort of, well, most of my characters march in, you know, I'm passively sitting at the typewriter, and they march in, they give me a little tap on the back of the head, and they say, hey, wait, here I am. And the next thing I know, I have, you know, I don't have to work hard to get one of them to do something. The characters that I would have trouble with are characters that don't know really where they're going or what they're doing. But Sarah was a person who didn't know she was going to be as brave and as hard in the center as she was, as painfully involved in not, and she was stubbornly involved in not letting go of her lover that had passed. As hard as she was at holding on to him, she became just as hard in trying to find out who had killed the translator. And she found her core, and that's kind of what she did. I mean, she came in slightly shy, slightly passive, slightly dulled from just her daily grind, but she was not, and she was in the middle of a lot of stuff, and it was fun. It was fun. It was not always happy, but it was fun. As a writer, I enjoyed this process.
Well, Loretta, that's the end of the questions that we have in the chat field from our listeners.
Okay, do we have any that haven't written them down?
Yeah, I think that might be it from this end.
Okay. So do any of your authors want to say a parting brilliant thought?
Well, I'll just say
Get us
thank you.
Get us to sleep well tonight.
Well, I'll just say thank you. I mean, history is full of stories, right? I think I wish I would have discovered historical fiction way earlier than I did, because it brings history alive for me. And so I encourage everyone to share these books with students, with young people. And I think that it would just be a much more enjoyable way of understanding the progression of where we came from or how we're connected. It makes everything come alive. So I just wanted to say thank you so much for having me. I've enjoyed this tremendously, and I'm eagerly waiting to read the books of my co-presenters, Loretta, Roger, and Margaret.
Great questions. Abalone Ukulele. A lot of people have trouble with that, but I know all of you know how to spell abalone in ukulele, or know how to find out.
Well, I guess what I could add is that there's almost a 2-year a period of 2 years between getting the novel a quarter of the way done and getting the novel 3/4 of the way finished. I dropped it for 2 years because it just wouldn't come together. It wouldn't come together.
Mm-hmm.
And one day it just did. It like it needed time to ripen, to bloom, to make its own way in the world, sort of. I mean, that's sort of corny maybe, but it did, and then it just happened, and then it was fun again, and it worked.
So in that period of hiatus, were you thinking about it? Were you feeling depressed? Was it just at the back of your mind? Did it nibble at you? How was that?
I busied myself with other things.
Mm-hmm.
And then I kind of just lost the energy that it takes to write, because it takes me a lot of physical energy just to stay at the computer and to keep at it. And what I ended up doing was because I was doing some articles and food articles and travel articles and things for other online things, and I said, why isn't this story working? Why didn't I? And I just went to it one day, and I started in, I think it was chapter 8 or 12, and one of the characters just sort of gently started to open up in my mind, and then I would say, okay, it's a slow start, restarting. It's kind of like an old car getting some new gas in it, and it started working again, and I find that for me that's writing. There's times when it works, there's times when it doesn't work, there's times that I don't work. I can't get it going.
Umberto Eco says research is better than imagination for inspiration. So as long as you're doing some research, you may come up with an idea.
Right, and that's what every bookstore I went to, I'd go to the Asian Center. I'd go to historical war. My husband's a real history buff, and he would say, okay, what are you in my department for? Because usually I would be in a different department, in the bookstore. But so, and then he started helping me. Say, oh, here's one. So we go up with our stack of books.
I was having dinner a couple of weeks ago with a friend in Connecticut who was married to a much older man who has since died, but he was a diplomat. And he was in Hanoi from 1949 to 51. Mm. And he was an American diplomat, and he was 100% against any US involvement. He came back to the US and wrote all of his papers and, all of his opinions and all of his dissents, and nobody listened. He felt he just scoped out the place for 2 years in Hanoi and just knew what was going to happen.
Very complicated time, very complicated time.
So I guess in closing, Faith, could we have you just bring us on into the home plate here?
Sure. I want to thank our panel again for joining us. It was a wonderful discussion. I really enjoyed it. I want to thank Loretta for putting this together. I know that she has been a little bit under the weather this past week, so it didn't show. You know, you did a lovely
Thank
job,
you.
Loretta. I
Thank you.
appreciate it.
Wow.
And again, my thanks to Susan for all the behind the scenes and tech work and the promotions on Facebook. Again, we have a lot of really good people working with us, and we'd like to get a few more. Many hands make light work. So thank you again, panel. Thank you again, participants. We appreciate all your support. And that concludes our program. We hope you enjoyed it and learned something new. You can find out more about the New York City chapter of the Historical Novel Society and our leadership at our website, or contact us at hns-nyc@mail.com. And finally, please consider supporting our volunteer panelists and hosts. You can contact them at their websites below. Thanks for joining us.